Ding, 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 ding.
Welcome to Talking Pictures Trivia, the podcast in which a group of geographically challenged friends explore movies through trivia as an excuse to keep their friendships alive. I'm one of these friends and today's host, Nick, and with me is...
Tom.
And KJ.
Great to have you back as always. Additionally, joining us as a guest for this episode is...
Patrick.
Thanks for joining us today, Patrick. Patrick and Tom worked on a bunch of shows together in Holy Cross, including Damn Yankees, where they both played Joe Boyd. Patrick also conveniently likes movies. For those joining us for the first time, we start off each episode with a movie quiz, which consists of 2 rounds of 3 questions to determine who will earn today's trivia crown. Then, once the fierce competition is over, we follow up with our famous movie rant where anything goes. Today's movie was suggested to us by Tom. We will be jumping into the drama romance film Broken Blossoms by D.W. Griffith, who is also known for Intolerance, Orphans of the Storm, Way Down East, and Birth of a Nation. Other big movies in 1919 included Blind Husbands, True Heart Susie, and Charlie Chaplin's Sunny Side. Tom, why don't you tell us a little bit about the plot of this movie and why you brought this to our attention today to discuss?
Okay, so this movie takes place in the Limehouse district of London, which was known as being a predominantly Chinese district in that area. And it follows a young man, Cheng Quan, I think is how we say his name, a Chinese man who emigrates there. And he meets Lucy, a young girl played by Lillian Gish, who is suffering from an abusive father, battling burrows. And after being beaten by her father, Lillian Gish's character, Lucy, finds Chang Quan and he takes care of her, treats her. When Battling Burrows finds out about this blossoming romance, he grabs Lucy, he beats Lucy to death. Chang then kills Battling Burrows and then kills himself. I saw this movie, I think in college. I think we mentioned seeing it in class, but I honestly don't remember seeing it in class. I remember seeing Orphans of the Storm in a class. I don't remember seeing this in a class. I saw a lot of D.W. Griffith movies when I was like 22, 21, something like that. And I watched all the full-length ones. And I, kind of wasn't really getting it. Years later, kind of watching them after turning 30 or whatnot, they had a much larger effect on me. And I, find this movie to be very, very tender. The whole thing, from the way the slides or the way the film is colored, to the use of music, and to kind of the way the story unfolds. It's a very small, very tender, and very kind of lyric film. And I now love it, even though when I first saw it, I didn't, really, it didn't really capture me in any way. How about you, KJ? What do you think?
I knew nothing about Broken Blossoms before watching it for this podcast. I did enjoy the movie, but it is from 1919, which comes with its own set of problems. If the racism and the loose handling of different cultures can be ignored, then I can absolutely appreciate the shots, the lighting, the tone, the atmosphere, if not the representation of the peoples in the movie. So I did enjoy it, but listeners that want to go watch this, just heads up, it's an older movie with older ideas. How about you, Nick?
Yeah, so I have a limited history with silent films. I did think of the ones I've seen, which really goes back to one of the ones we saw earlier in our show, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, that this one was also well done. I did notice, even though it was around the same time period, I thought it was a little crisper, as KJ was talking about, with some of the shots, the lighting, the tone. And I actually was pretty impressed how they were able to depict a lot of emotions within this story. Even when you're not in the intertitles, you understand how these people are feeling. And I'm sure we're going to get into that a little bit more. I don't want to get into any of the potential questions. It was quite a sad tale, but I thought it was well done. KJ is absolutely right. You have to put aside and understand the time frame in which this movie was created. And you have to understand that most of those influences are coming from the person in this movie who is a bad character. He's the one who's the biggest offender of a lot of those situations. But I do think it was a well-made movie, and the story itself was quite enjoyable, but yes, very sad. Patrick, what were your thoughts on this film?
So yeah, like Tom and I went to college together. So I know for a fact that yes, we were assigned this movie in a class. Like I'm 100% positive that we were. However, I'm also 100% positive I didn't watch it when we were assigned it for that class. So maybe that's why we don't remember it, because we probably didn't actually watch it.
Yeah, we might not have
Yeah,
watched the movie.
but I'm positive we were assigned it, because I remember sitting with some other friends from that class and making a lot of jokes about the film, because as you point out, it to a modern audience, I mean, it is radically tone deaf. However, as you say, like you kind of have to understand the context in which it's coming out, and especially for D.W. Griffith, I think, his history with some other films that he's had, in particular Birth of a Nation, he's kind of carried a lot of accusations of racism in large part because of that film, and he spends part of his time, and I think this follows that trend of trying to almost undo his claims that he's racist, and in some ways he just kind of furthers them, but he's kind of trying to sort of, he's using shorthand, essentially, to your point, like he's sort of just kind of short changing some of these cultures and using contemporary shorthand. So it's like he can just say that this is an Asian character and this is a poor British character who's angry, and this is a white maiden woman, so he can use shorthand, and that's just, I think, a strategy that's used frequently by a lot of art, literature, film of that time period. So he's in some ways handicapped just by the language and visual and everything that his culture would be using anyway. But to your point, it certainly comes across as tone deaf in a modern audience. But even then, I think, Tom, you've got a good idea there too, which is almost, especially compared to some other pieces, it's almost like it's a little kind of curio piece. Like it's not epic, it's not huge, it's very small. Most of it's taking place in small indoor locations. It's a very limited character set. It's about relationships among a very small group of characters. And so for that reason, I do think it, as a piece, it kind of shines out, because of that, despite the difficulties that it's going to have. Like there's just no getting around it. But despite that fact, I think as a piece, if you kind of understand the language that he's trying to use, it is quite effective.
Okay. Now, Patrick, we ask each one of our guests a critical question at the beginning of these episodes. What do you recommend to be the ideal snack to enjoy while watching Broken Blossoms?
So I think you need two things, because you've got two totally different worlds you have to kind of bring together to appreciate this film. So I thought, if you've ever been to, you can get these beers outside of New York City, but if you've ever been to McSorley's Tavern in New York City, that is like that's what you imagine Battling Burroughs' life to be. Like that's where he's going and getting his drinks. That's where, like that's the food that he eats is what you're going to get at McSorley's Tavern. So like I think you have to get like a McSorley's ale. Like you need to have one of those just so you can appreciate like the sort of that lifestyle. And I think if you're going to also go and say, well, you've also got sort of the softer side of life, especially coming in from the other characters and sort of the Asian influence. So I would say you need to get a vegetable lo mein. It has to be vegetable lo mein. I don't think you can get like a pork lo mein or something else, because I think you have to appreciate probably the sort of the softer side. My guess is our Cheng Huan is a vegetarian. So I'm going to say that you need to have a vegetable lo mein and a McSorley's ale, and then you can appreciate the both parts of this film.
Definitely an interesting pairing, and the one thing that's great about McSorley's is they serve in very small glasses, but then you just have a lot of glasses in front of you at the end of it. It's great.
Maybe we'll reach out to McSorley's and see if they'll do a viewing of Broken Blossoms with a special menu item.
Maybe they can just pay us. How about that?
Yeah, we gave them a plug. Not that they need it.
It's time for Movie Quiz.
First, we'll start with round one. In round one, each question is worth 1 point. And I will let Pat pick from our categories. Our categories are Limehouse style, melodrama, and reasons. So, Pat, what would you like?
Let's start with melodrama. How about that?
It's time for question 1.
Melodrama comes from the French sensationalist dramas and English music hall ballads that involve high tense emotions, obvious morality, and grand demonstrations. Why and how do you think this movie uses melodrama, or one or more of its tenets, using a specific example from the picture?
Locked in.
Locked in.
All right, locked in.
I may have had to look up melodrama.
I should have looked up melodrama.
All right, we'll start. Pat, what is your answer?
So I will start with the example I would give of a melodramatic scene, I think, is when they're contrasting they have the boxing scene going on where Battling Burrows is having his big prize fight, and they're contrasting that with the scene sort of in the upstairs room above the shop where Lucy is with Cheng Huan, and they're having this sort of very tender moment. But what I think is going on is I think you're meant to make a pretty clear contrast between the fact of, okay, there's this big brawl going on, this sort of action sequence thing being combined with this moment of, it's very clear that Cheng Huan is tempted to basically make their relationship physical with Lucy. And so there's, two different battles going on, one in his mind and one sort of being contrasted with this big spectacle fight going on at the same time. So to me, it's just very, and, then there's a big title card that comes up and says, but his love remains pure or something like that. And he doesn't touch her. He leaves her alone. So it's a very clear sort of, to your point, moral message that this is not meant to be a physical relationship. This is entirely meant to be a sort of spiritual, emotional, supportive relationship between the two of them, and he sort of overcomes his temptation, in the same way that a boxer overcomes his opponent. So it's a dramatic big scene, and you got big music going on with it. It's melodramatic, like it is, but it has a very, very clear sort of moral point at the end of it, which I think fits with your definition, Tom. But I think that it's sort of why do they use it? In part, it might be because of potentially the sort of controversial nature of what he was dealing with at the time, and as I think we've said, I don't remember if we said it specifically, but it's like an interracial relationship at this time period would have been almost unheard of and potentially even illegal, depending on where you are. So the fact that he's dealing with a very controversial topic, he kind of needs to hit it with a hammer to make it very clear that this is not what people would be potentially offended by, although he's clearly trying to nudge it in that direction to say that actually it's you need to be more tolerant, again, I think is part of his point here. But he is kind of, I think, hitting it with a hammer, very emotionally charged answer here and a very emotionally charged scene in order to get that point across of why he's doing it. So I think that's part of the reason why he's using melodrama in that particular circumstance.
So I may not understand what melodrama is, but here's my answer. So Pat had talked about Cheng Huan staying pure. There was a scene that foreshadowed that when he's coming over from China. He's on the boat, I'm pretty sure, and he's down with a group of people who aren't as pure as he is, and he resists temptation with a woman, and that's the scene I'm going with.
This isn't my answer, but to KJ's point on that too, I believe he refers to her as white blossom, which is pure. So going along with that pure line. But to my answer, I think when we talk about things that are sensationalized for the audience to kind of exaggerate for emotion, it really comes around the main character, one of the main characters, which is Battling Burrows, to show how wicked and evil this person is. There's really two scenes, so I don't know if that'll be within the parameters of the question, but it has to do with when you see he's a drunkard who takes pleasure out of beating his daughter, okay? And in one of the earlier scenes, she's serving him, she's trying to please him, but there's a scene where he literally is saying, if you don't do this, oh, I know what it was. She came back still earlier than he demanded for his tea. Okay, but he was in a bad mood and he was drunk. So he still said, I'm going to whip you. And she's pleading. When he said, I'm going to whip you, I thought that was like like synonymous for I'm going to beat you up. He literally had a whip under his bed that he took out and then proceeded to whip her with it. And then later, this is the next sequence in the same room where he's very irate with her, and he literally takes that same whip. This time he's taking the handle and he's beating her literally to death, okay, with the handle of the whip. I mean, that was really over the top to show you, to really strike emotion with the audience about how evil it is that this person could exist and how good of a person she was, and she still was being subjected to all of this abuse and honestly died from it. So I thought that was a really powerful tool within this movie to really show how horrible the lead antagonist was in this movie.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. And I think the point is going to go to Pat. Congratulations, Pat. What I liked about the answer was it took the kind of the melodramatic convention, the kind of over the top moralizing or over the top sensationalism, and combined it with the moralizing and grounded it in D.W. Griffith's kind of intercutting, which he became, very, very famous for. And the kind of the moral or moralizing aspect of this film was very interesting to me, especially relative to kind of its time period. Because if you know, like 1919, this movie is in part kind of a response to the Yellow Peril type situation, both in England and in America. And this movie's like it feels English, but it also is clearly like an American picture for this reason. Is that you had a large Asian population coming over, and there was this fear that they were the Asian immigrants were going to sort of degrade the morals of the women who were both Asian women and American women. Um, and there was a lot of kind of art that came out at this time. Cecil B. DeMille had a movie, I think, in 1915, that was kind of about the rapacious Asian threat. And the kind of moral idea of a higher love or a loftier thing vis-a-vis the kind of brutality of the Anglo-Saxon is in part a kind of a corrective move, I think, on the part of Griffith to the belief that a lot of people had regarding this kind of Asian peril, that these people were these kind of rapacious individuals.
I was gonna say, I think it's Europe, America in particular, obviously has more of an immigrant culture anyway, history anyway, but England certainly does to a certain extent too. So your point is that, yeah, there's always sort of, going back for many generations, there's sort of always this kind of terror that, like, as people come in, that it's somehow going to change things, and then things are going to start degrading. Whether you go back to the Irish in the 19th century, you have large groups of Eastern Europeans coming in the late 19th century, you have large groups of Asians coming in the early 20th century, and into today. I mean, it's a long serving trend that goes on for very long periods of time in US history. So yeah, I think that this movie is certainly an attempt to basically go and say, and to that point, it's again, I think it's why it's using melodrama to some extent, and it does have to, it's using these sort of cultural shorthands as a means to go do that in a way that, yeah, to a modern audience, it still comes across as very sort of naive at best. But it's, to your point, yeah, I think there is at least an attempt by D.W. Griffith to try to go and to offer a counter to that.
Certainly. I mean, Cheng Huang is the hero of the story, right? So the fact that he used not his own culture as the hero, I feel like is probably pretty progressive for 1919.
And my guess is that he's probably also trying to make a case that in some ways, especially since the irony is that Cheng Huang is supposed to be the peace loving, the one who's supposed to that he wants to bring his message of peace to the Anglo-Saxons, and yet he's the one who shoots the guy like 7 times at the end of the movie. He's probably like, he is brutally violent at the end of this movie. And so I think it's also probably trying to make a case that actually the West might be the corrupting influence here, not the other way around, that this guy ends up far worse off at the end of the movie than basically any of the other characters did, compared to where he started and where he ends up. He's the one who actually has to undergo the worst transformation for the fact. So I think that's also something that it's trying to make clear, is that it's actually the bad influence is going the other way in this instance.
That's definitely an interesting take. I did not think about that, Patrick, when I first watched it, but I think that does resonate and makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I'm sure would come up in the episode sometime, but talking about things that were not progressive, what I found interesting, again, Cheng Huan is the protagonist or one of the leads here, one of the more innocent, as KJ was saying. But interestingly enough, Cheng Huan is played not by a Chinese person or an Asian person at all. It actually is an actor by the name of Richard Barthelmess. So I thought it was interesting that back in the day there, they wouldn't really care about that. And I know nowadays that would definitely be an Asian lead. But it jumped out at me the whole movie. I couldn't avoid realizing that person actually was not Asian.
Yeah, that was pretty conventional. You would never have minority people on screen. I mean, Birth of a Nation, any person with, quote unquote lines, it's a silent movie, was a white person in blackface. And that's kind of the same here. You could have minority kind of extras, but you couldn't just have that on screen. That was not.
They did even in this movie. There were the extras or the non-main roles. But I do know that was just of the times. But talking about looking at a movie from today, back in 1919, it did jump out at me. There was also another character, Evil Eye, which is one of the higher titled characters in this movie. He really didn't have much to do with it. But that was also by Edward Peel Sr. So those were the two Asian characters, or actually Chinese characters for this movie that were not played by any kind of Asians.
All right, shall we jump into question 2? Okay, and I'll let KJ pick this time. So we have Limehouse Style and Reasons.
I'll go with Reasons.
It's time for question 2.
Why does Chang Quan say he wants to come to England?
Locked in.
Yeah, locked in.
Locked in?
All right, since KJ sounded most confused, let's start with him. What do you have?
I don't remember, maybe at all, but was it to spread the peace and harmony of China or his religion in England? That's what I'm going with.
Just to elaborate on what KJ was saying, I believe it was in the right theme, but I think specifically, if I recall, he was Buddhist, and I believe he wanted to share that with the Western world. It's, again, peace and harmony, but I think it was his Buddhist background that he wanted to share.
Yeah, similar answer. Yeah, I think he specifically says Buddhism. He wants to share the message of peace of Buddhism with specifically Anglo-Saxon, is what he says. But yeah, he wants to spread his message of the peace of Buddhism to the Anglo-Saxons.
All right, and I think the point goes to everyone because you all basically said the same thing. The intertitle reads: "The Yellow Man holds a great dream to take the glorious message of peace to the barbarous Anglo-Saxons, sons of turmoil and strife." And yeah, I thought I'd put a kind of easy fact question in there, but this kind of picks up on something you were saying before, Pat, about the way influence works in the other direction. That it doesn't, he doesn't end up influencing basically anyone. That he becomes the kind of the corrupted one, and I think that starts even earlier than the final scene or the climax when he shoots Battling Burrows like 87 times in 4 seconds. When we see him over in the Limehouse area, there's a kind of montage of cuts of the sort of the underbelly, with a lot of people kind of gambling. There's sort of a depiction of what we can imagine are loose women, and I'm kind of interested in that, in the way the Limehouse is shown as an influence on this character.
Yeah, I mean, I think specifically there's again, I'm guessing at the times they couldn't specifically say it, but there's also a strong implication that he's basically addicted to opium at this point. I think there's shots of him smoking, from a very long pipe. There's shot, I think there's I can't remember the exact title card, but it's quite kind of, it's like he goes back to the shop with a whiff of like the corrupt breath on like wind on his breath. It's like that, it's some like reference where it's like, okay, clearly the same. Okay, the guy's smoking something, and probably I'm thinking the implication is opium. And so, I mean, he's already kind of trying to sort of forget himself amongst this sort of very seedy, not particularly great neighborhood.
So, last question for everyone is Limehouse style.
It's time for question 3.
In order to capture the feel of the Limehouse district of London, Griffith often used stylized sets and miniatures drawn from landscape artists such as Charles Hamy. How would you describe the style, that is the look and texture, of this film and justify your description?
Locked in.
Locked in.
Locked in.
All right, Nick, let's start with you.
When I think about the style of this film, especially the exterior as well as interior shots in many respects, gritty and poor. That's kind of the feeling I get when I watch this. So talking about an internal shot, when you're at Battling Burrows' place, it is the stereotypical, I have tough times and I'm poor. They have one table, one chair, there's a bed in the background, a stove, like very bare bones. You can almost feel like the dust and the dirt on things. And then there's another scene where they go into his bedroom, which I actually thought it was for a while. I thought that was a one-room place. And his room also has one small table, one chair, and a bed, like very minimalist, and it's just dark and dirty. Even when they're going through on an exterior shot, even when they're going through the streets, you can see like the dirt and the fog and almost like soot and smoke in the air when they're traveling from Cheng Huan's shop to where Lucy lives. That happens a few times from a few different people. And that's what I would say. I just, the gritty, dirty, poor vibe going on.
So what I was actually going to say is like, as far as like a style goes, I don't know, I had to look up his name because I couldn't remember his name. It's Joseph Cornell. And he's this artist who did like a lot of like mixed media, kind of found media things. And he used to make these like almost like shoebox style things, and he would make kind of collect various objects in them. And he had this sort of that was sort of his like kind of experimentalist art creations. And in some ways it reminds me of that. Like it does have this, I think I like your idea of like, yeah, it's sort of like all these interior scenes they're very carefully placed with like specific objects meant to sort of depict and sort of connote a specific thing. And so it's like, the shop is specifically sort of organized with all this kind of clutter around it, and like the upstairs room is specifically organized with like very specific objects meant to communicate a specific thing about any specific character. So it's sort of, it has almost all the interior scenes almost have this kind of collected hodgepodge feel to them, and sort of this not quite found art, but it sort of has this sort of like intentional clutter almost feel to it. Like everywhere you kind of go, there's always this kind of feeling that everything is sort of mismatched and cluttered and things are just thrown around, but it feels intentional in some way. And I think it sort of helps to get across some of that, the sort of just the message of the film, or just sort of the environment that he's trying to communicate.
So before I answer, I just want to go back. Nick was describing Battling Burrows' dwelling. And Tom, you had lived in Brooklyn for a while, and in my head, New York City is so expensive. So whenever I pictured your apartment in Brooklyn, it was very similar to Battling Burrows' little house, except there was a bare light bulb hanging right in the middle of the room, and that was the only lighting source.
Yeah, I lived in like the upper, in like when I first moved to the city, I lived in like a studio apartment. It was like 300 square feet, like, and it was literally like a bed, like the kitchen was like right next to it, and there was like a little hallway to the bathroom. And I remember one of my brothers being like, do you want to borrow, like, I have a table if you want it. I'm like, it wouldn't fit in my apartment. He's like, it's really small, like it's fine. I'm like, literally there is no room, like there is nothing left in this apartment that will fit here.
No room at the end.
Yeah, like there is nothing. There is no space for any additional furniture or anything. Like that is it. Like this is New York.
But for my actual answer, I would describe this movie as Blade Runner 1919. I think there's a lot of similarities in the way it looks and felt as Blade Runner. And that would be an easy way to describe it.
Okay, how is it like Blade Runner if Blade Runner was in 1919?
It felt quite foggy. As Patrick was saying, it felt quite placed. So every object there either represented something or was supposed to be on set. Very similar to Blade Runner, how it's filled with stuff to show how the future that Ridley Scott was trying to show. It's also very dark and very contained, but it felt like if you looked around the corner, you would see a whole another part of this world, but that wasn't important to the movie.
So I think the points are going to go to Nick and Pat. No offense, KJ, but I don't see that at all with the Blade Runner thing. I was going to say, if you mentioned the fact that they're both representing Asian districts, I remember Blade Runner was a predominantly Asian area.
Was that more Japanese influence? Was that more Japanese influence?
Yeah, I guess it was Japanese.
But still,
okay, yeah. I mean, it's pretty
Asian cultures in general.
Yeah, but yeah. Other than that, I don't really see the Blade Runner influence. But I think what I liked a lot about what you were saying, Nick, the kind of the interiors and the smokiness, and there is a kind of impressionistic aspect to this. And if you know Griffith's other films, I don't know if I think Pat, you've seen the other ones because
I've seen a number of the other ones. Yeah, I've seen a number of the other ones over the years, but yeah.
Yeah, we were in class where we were supposed to watch the other ones.
Yes, we did. The other ones I did watch. It's just this one. It's just this one that I'm 100% certain I didn't watch.
But Griffith's other movies are like big spectacles. That's how he became famous. He was, like very, very large movies. I mean, at one point he actually went to the Battle of the Somme in World War I and filmed it, and it was too boring, so he restaged it in order to kind of sell. So this movie's a big departure from that because it's this interior film, and also very impressionistic. And I like how you guys, Nick and Pat, kind of picked up on that a lot because I felt the same way, especially about this idea of like intentional clutter. The room is sort of a representation of what like the brute Anglo-Saxon's room is supposed to look like. There's nothing really particularly individualistic about this. Like you'd think like maybe boxing gloves or something would be hanging up, but it's just like this type of man lives here. This other type of man lives here.
This one's a drunkard. This one's addicted to opium.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Yeah, there's no boxing gloves. There's no indication of what he is.
Yeah. Well, they may have been in that closet that she hid in that he tried to chop down.
But we see the inside of the closet. There's nothing in there.
Because he just got back from his boxing match.
Oh, maybe he's still wearing it. But yeah, the other thing too with your answer, the kind of the Cornell whatever they call the box of
I think they are dioramas.
Dioramas, yeah.
I think that's what he called them.
Yeah, Griffith actually filmed dioramas. Some of this is that, like a lot of the exterior shots of either London or of whatever part of China that our character comes from is actually, it's a model with like a toy boat being moved across the screen in order to kind of to set that kind of tone or that intimacy, which I don't think Griffith does again or did before. And I didn't notice it until it was pointed out to me. I was reading about this movie and how he was relying on this artist Charles Hemme, how he's influenced by him, and they made these little models and he would film the model as an exterior shot. And I thought that that really did help set the tone.
I didn't catch that at all, but maybe that's just because I thought that's how silent films look like because of the filming technology back there. But now that I know that, that's pretty cool. Well, that concludes round one. We'll be right back after this quick commercial break.
Perfectly Placed is a service where we perfectly place instructions, items, and other things you need to get you through your day. But enough from me, let's hear from one of our customers.
I'm Gary, and I'm being paid to promote Perfectly Placed. Well, shoot, we've all been there, sitting in the can, feeling much better after dropping what we're going to leave behind. We look over, and instead of seeing the white, fluffy paper of the gods, we see the brown cardboard that shows us it's the end of the roll. It's my fault. I meant to replace the roll. And this is not the first time this has happened. And it is not the last time. At first, I thought, oh well, I'll just have to... But then I saw it. Folded neatly and nicely. Within arm's reach was the perfect number of squares needed for this exact situation. You're a lifesaver, Perfectly Placed. You've really helped to clean up my life. Perfectly Placed. We get around to reminding you what you'll get around to.
And we're back. Tom, take it away.
All right. So far, we have Pat leading with 3 points, Nick right behind him with 2, and KJ trailing with 1. In our next round, we have each question worth 2 points. And there's a little wrinkle in this round that we haven't done before. You are, if you'd like, able to substitute a question that I ask for a more straightforward fact question. However, once you substitute it, you can't go back. Pat, I will let you pick the categories. They are quotes and paraphrases. James Agee, quotes and paraphrases Lillian Gish, quotes and paraphrases Richard Scheckel.
Let's go with Lillian Gish to start.
It's time for question 4.
Gish reports Griffith's instructions to her that one of her characters understood to represent, quote, the essence of all girlhood, not just one girl, and that Gish attempted to embody, quote, the essence of virginity, end quote. Interpret this quote through the performances of the film, using at least one scene as an example.
I'm terrified of the fact-based question, so I locked in.
I'll lock it in.
No, unlocked. Give me the fact. Unlocked.
Oh, okay. I was like, somebody needs to do the fact question because I want to at least hear the fact question. So if KJ will do it, then I'll lock in.
Yeah. I'm not going to say the fact question until everybody's locked in.
Okay, I'm locked in then.
I think that just increased my odds because now do I have a 50-50 or am I also competing against KJ's fact?
Are you competing against Pat, though? Pat, you're locked in for the quote, right?
Yeah, we're both locked in for the quote. So it's just between you and me now.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
But KJ
There's
can
one thing.
just get it wrong.
Got it.
course,
Got
yeah.
it. Got it. Got it.
Well,
Got
and
it. Okay.
KJ will probably get it.
All right. So I'll introduce the fact question now. KJ, what is the only diegetic sound we encounter in this movie? You are not allowed to look up diegetic.
Locked in.
You're the only one.
I still gotta lock in. Should I answer? Are we doing the subjective one first?
Let's do the fact question first, because it's funnier.
Yeah, it is. So the only diegetic sound that we hear during the movie. All right, so diegetic might mean hearing somebody eat. It might. And if that's the case, it's a trick question because it was a silent movie. So we don't hear a diegetic sound in the movie.
Okay, that is incorrect.
It's a great answer.
A diegetic sound is a sound that occurs within the world of the film, as opposed to, let's say, a soundtrack. There is one sound we hear it 3 times. It's the bell, the ringing of the bell in Asia.
Name the dietetic song.
All right.
To be afraid of the fact-based question, I think.
Thank you, KJ. That was very entertaining. So now, in terms of the quote question, let's start with Nick. What do you have?
I have to gain my composure. Give me a second. That was really funny. Give me a second. Okay. What was the question again?
So this is Gish's quote. She, quote, was told to represent the essence of girlhood, not just one girl, and that she attempted to embody, quote, the essence of virginity.
Okay, got it. Okay, so the scene in which she was beaten and Cheng Huan had taken her back to his store, brought her up to second level, gave her a nice dress and some jewelry and had her lying there to recover. he goes through a whole conversation with her and explains that she is a white blossom. So that is the perfect symbol for everything that she represents, how she lives her life, and who she is. And that's the perfect label for the lifestyle that she wishes to live, and that he can see that essence through her as she lives her days. She doesn't realize that he kind of is an admirer from a distance even before that event. And that's his true feelings about what she portrays in a very dark and dreary neighborhood. She is the white blossom.
Okay, so it's that scene where she's kind of sitting outside his shop, and then she crosses the street, and he follows.
I believe he referred when he actually says the white blossom is when she's upstairs, and correct me if I'm wrong, and she's lying there and he's explaining to her to recover. I believe that's where he says the actual white blossom line.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, Pat, what do you have?
So I wanted to mention the scene where she's it's after I think Battling Burrows is left and he said like I want my tea by 5 o'clock or whatever in this thing. And so she goes and there's a stone on the door by the door that she's like hidden there, and she kind of pulls that up. And underneath it there's like a silk ribbon, and then there's like a piece of tinfoil. And so the thing and then so she takes the tinfoil, so she puts the ribbon in her hair, and then she takes the tinfoil and tries to trade it for a flower, which they won't take. They say there's not enough tinfoil for her to get a flower. So the reason I wanted to kind of mention that song is, to me, it almost has there's a few things that sort of come out of that, as you said, like it's supposed to be this kind of universality of like of womanhood and childhood and this kind of thing, and virginity and sort of just simplicity, and I like the idea for a number of reasons. Like it's incredible. I think this is something a lot of children have. Like, it's incredibly childlike to have like this little hiding place for like little knickknacks and this kind of stuff that that a child might go put in there. And I believe with the ribbon, there's some sort of, I can't remember exactly. There's a note in there, and I don't remember exactly what it says, but it says something along the lines of like, "It's not much, but here's something for you." And it always struck me, especially this kind of ribbon, this kind of silk ribbon, and almost has this kind of like dowry wedding feel kind of thing of like something she's being given as like her only possession. And then the fact that she also has this like tinfoil that she thinks she can go trade for flour, it also has this like very childlike aspect of like a child going into a store and trying to buy basically something for nothing. And so to my mind, it did have this very sort of universal feel of this little girl dressing up the best that she can in sort of this very pure way, and trying just in a very pure way to go and trade a knickknack for a flower, and sort of carry this, again, to your point, I think the flower certainly does carry the symbolism of her sort of purity. And so the fact that she's just trying to go and buy a simple flower with this sort of piece of trash essentially, so it sort of carries to me this sort of it sort of carries that notion of just like she's extremely simple. She's basically like a child. She's just trying to, dress herself up as best as she can to get, just even the most simple kind of things of beauty. And I think it carries that through, in the sense of what you're trying to say, that if Gish is trying to kind of embody sort of purity and childhood and just simplicity and sort of virginity and this kind of thing, to me that scene carries a lot of that quality with it in sort of what she's supposed to represent.
Yeah, and the letter it seems like to be from a mother, but
That's
it
what I
does say
assumed.
this is,
Yeah, that's what I assumed.
yeah, but it does say this is for your
Yeah,
wedding
and I think
day. Like,
that's what I was
here's
like. I
a
think it even says it
ribbon
in
for
there.
your wedding
Yeah,
day.
and that's what I think. I was like, it
Mhm,
almost does have this sort of dowry feel to it, that this is for your
mhm,
this is a pure thing for you to keep with you.
mhm. All right, great. And I think the points are going to Pat. The reason being, no points for KJ, just to remind you, KJ. The reason being that I think Pat's answer focused on actions that Lillian Gish's character was taking, as opposed to responses to. I think both of those are important in kind of structuring the essence of someone. How everybody in the cast is supposed to respond to her slash how she acts. But yeah, I think that's interesting that you picked up on this, and I did want to talk about this. Is the kind of girlhood of this person? I think in the source material, the short story by Thomas Burke, which this is based on, I think she's 14 years old, and Lillian Gishier's 26, 27, something like that. But from what I can see in the movie and from, kind of interviews with Gish when she's talking about this, she was trying to play the character as kind of the embodiment of girlhood, of like youngness. So she's always kind of bent over and kind of looking up and things like that. Um, and as Pat and I have both performed on stage before. It seems odd to think of having to approach a performance by being told you have to play the essence of girlhood or the essence of anything. Like you have to be the essence of masculinity or brutality or
Like
sophistication or
it's like
something
the
like
play in
that.
the Seagull. It's like that play at the beginning of the Seagull. That's all it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the opening of The Seagull, one of the characters writes a play that's like kind of an abstract and kind of stupid, absurd play that, no one can really perform well. But yeah, I was thinking about how performance is done in this. So, especially Lillian Gish, but really anyone people want to pick up on. What about the performance, and what about the kind of style of performance was effective or grabbed your attention?
I just want to say I thought she was excellent in this movie, and there was one specific element that she would do throughout the film that I thought was catchy and unique, and I really enjoyed it. Whenever he tells his daughter to put a smile on her face, she gets her two fingers next to her lips and literally pulls them up into a smile. It's the most forced smile that you can do, and she does it a few times, and I think she does it at the end almost for herself. But that was a very interesting thing. When I talked about in my intro about how I thought it for a silent film, I was amazed how much it portrayed emotions. Most, if not all, I'd say a majority of those emotions are specifically from her performance. That she really portrays a lot through of her emotions through just her different facial expressions and tone and presentation on the screen. So I thought she did a tremendous job.
Yeah, Tom, maybe you know this. I actually am curious because that is like, I know that the smile thing is like sort of, he is that something she did, or is that like is there any like anybody ever talk about that in any of the other stuff you've read? Like, is that something she did, or is that something Griffith told her to do, or is that in the script, or like where did that come from?
I don't know. I know with I honestly didn't get that from I know the closet
Yeah.
scene was something she came up with on her own. And a lot of times Griffith would go through, if I've actually seen tapes of Griffith teaching actors, and he goes through every single motion he wants them to do. And so I think most actors would just kind of follow it. And so I think the smile thing, which for our audience that doesn't know, Lillian Gish is so sad. Lucy is so sad that in order to smile, she has to force the smile on her face using her middle finger and index finger. But for most of the time, that's how Griffith dealt with actors. It was like, you do this exactly. When she did the closet scene, and for our audience who hasn't seen this, when Lillian Gish's character Lucy is beaten to death, she first hides in a closet, and when she's in the closet, she does like a 360. She turns in a full circle in kind of desperation. And this scene is very, very famous. I mean, it's a subtopic on Wikipedia about the movie. That's how famous it is. That was something she came up with on her own, and apparently it was so kind of surprising to Griffith that he brought in someone else to watch her when they shot it again for the second take, and apparently it was so effective the man lost his breakfast while watching. Um, so I think with Lillian Gish, there was a lot more liberality in terms of what she was allowed to do and how much he kind of put the pins in, so to speak, with their performance. I think with other people, he was a little more firm. But that doesn't really quite answer your question because honestly,
No,
I
I was
don't
just
know.
curious because I was curious since
Yeah.
you brought it up. I was like, I actually never really thought about that. Is that something she did, or where did it come from? I was just curious about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't catch that. I just know some stuff was stuff she had improved.
So what I really, really liked about the diegetic sounds was how seamlessly they just faded right into the score. I mean, you see the bells, you hear the bells, but it was a nice moment there in the movie.
I agree with KJ. in a non-facetious way, because when I watched it, I have a limited viewing of different silent films. They actually timed it up, so I didn't know if it was like coincidence at first, but they did it, as you mentioned, Tom, 3 times. I'm like, oh no, that's a stylistic effect that they're going for. So regardless of the definition of diegetic, that jumped out at me when I was watching the film.
But the bell ringing also frames the movie, right? I mean, it starts with the bells before he leaves, and then it comes in sometime in the middle when he's in the Limehouse district, and at the end, that's the last shot we get is the bells kind of ringing, and so it's kind of a framing device. I don't know what that means, other than framing devices are nice ways to envelope your movie. But yeah, I think going back to kind of the performance as essence type thing, um, it's kind of interesting because at this time, I mean, Pat, I think you know this history pretty well. It's like the idea of performing an essence was not um, not on the rise, so to speak. The kind of a lived character was something that was taught to people and taught to actors at this time and for a few decades before. And so the performance style, as I think even maybe old in terms of kind of stagecraft for this time, although it seems to be pretty fresh in terms of movies, that you'd still be using this kind of older, maybe mid 19th century style for silent pictures, while on stage you were using a kind of more sophisticated style. But I don't know if that is necessarily a consequence of everything old seems more fake than it does today. And I was wondering what people thought about that. Is this just sort of archetypes that it doesn't matter who you are, just step into the archetype? Or do we see, not just with Gish, but with the other performers, um, the kind of lived character that are constantly complimented today?
All the characters in this movie seemed more like caricatures than lived in people, at least to me. But like you say, Tom, I don't know if it's because it feels old timey, so I'm expecting that in some ways.
To your point, it's the style. I think to your point, it's sort of like theater at this time is certainly going more and more towards what would be called like method acting at a later point. I don't actually know how much I don't know how much of that has actually kind of permeated into the West though yet, because a lot of that doesn't come until later when you start having sort of, I think it's like the Michael Chekhovs, and they start spreading sort of Stanislavskian techniques to the West in the 40s more. So I mean, you can even, but to your point, yeah, there certainly are these aren't really like battling Burroughs, like other than the fact that he is like angry and drunk and violent. You don't really know anything about the guy, and he never does anything other than those things. Like there's that guy goes through nothing. Like nothing happens to that guy from the beginning to the end. He's a prop device. Like he doesn't actually move anything. And same thing with a lot of the characters. Like Evil Eye doesn't do anything. He's just there to make things messy and spread rumors and sort of be like he doesn't do anything either. So a lot of these characters, that nothing really happens to them, with the exception really of Lucy and Cheng Huan. But even then, I mean, it's sort of like Cheng Huan's character's name is, I think in the credits, he doesn't even have his name. You only know it because it's on the store. His name is just like the Yellow Man. It's like the Yellow Man, Evil Eye, battling Burroughs. Like they do have this sort of everyman quality to them, where each person's just kind of stuffed into the thing to move the plot along. And that's partially also probably melodrama. It's probably just a product of the fact that this is a melodrama. Like it's meant to be big and bold and make you cry. Like it's sort of the point of it. So yeah, it's almost old timey for old timey. Like it feels old even for an old film. And I think to your point, when you were saying like this sort of impressionistic style, I think that's actually probably the best word for it, because it does. It has this very much like if you looked at an impressionist painting, there's no specific pieces that are usually meant to stand out. You're meant to look at the thing as a whole. And maybe that's why it's done the way it is, because it's not really meant for any specific parts of it to sort of stand out, or any specific characters. It's more meant to be seen as a holistic, perhaps.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the idea, especially of essence, is that there's no clear border, and so it all sort of bleeds together. And I think you're right. There's no part that stands out, right? It's part of this. It's part of this kind of impression of reality as opposed to reality itself. But yeah, well said. All right, Nick. Now the remaining categories are.
I had a quick question before we go into the next two questions. I have no idea who James A.G. or Richard Schickel are. How are they involved?
That's why I picked Lily and Gish, because I didn't know who they were either. So that's why I picked
Yeah,
Gish.
because I thought they were actors in the movie, and I was looking. I'm like, I don't see these names anywhere.
They're digestive artists.
Dietetic.
Diegetic artists.
No, it's diegetic.
They're digestive artists. It's disgusting.
Johnny Chestnut, he's a digestive artist.
Oh. All right. Now the remaining categories are quotes and paraphrases from James A.G., a film critic and film writer. He actually wrote the first draft of Night of the Hunter from our previous episode. Or quotes and paraphrases from Richard Scheckel, who is a film historian. What would you like?
Let's get a little history in our lives. Let's go with Richard Scheckel.
It's time for question 5.
Richard Scheckel said that this film has a sort of gritty realism that inspired Pabst, Stiller, von Sternberg, and reemerged in the US as the sound era as film noir. Is he right or wrong, and why? Using an example from the film.
Fact question.
Yeah, I'll jump on the fact boat because it went pretty well last time.
Yeah, so I automatically get the point. I'm sticking with what I got then.
Gentlemen, that was bad strategy.
I'm sticking. I'll stick in. Locked in. Not stick. Not
Okay.
sticking. Locked.
If you get this wrong, Pat.
So, for KJ and Nick, here's the fact question. What are the first two pieces of advice Lillian Gish's character, Lucy, is given?
Will there be partial credit?
No.
Oh, if I get one, I don't get one? Okay.
I'll give you partial credit.
All
whatever.
right. I am half locked in.
I'll be locked in.
The other half is now locked in.
Okay, so let's start with the fact questions first. And I'll ask Nick first. What is the advice Lucy gets?
One of the advice that she gets is not to get married. She's with some lady who's got a bunch of kids, and the husband's just kind of sitting there, and she's taking care of everything and says, do not get married. The other advice that she gets is don't do opium.
All right, you get half credit there. Nobody ever tells you not to do opium. All right, KJ, what do you have?
I couldn't remember, but I'd like to expand on Nick's second answer there. And yeah, this movie might have been kind of a PSA for, don't do drugs. That's, in the end, what got everybody.
Okay, so that's no points for you, buddy.
Can I take a shot at the second one?
Yes, please.
She's told not to become a prostitute.
Exactly.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I remember that now. Yep.
Yes, it was
She's
after
walking
the
by.
marrieds. Yes.
Yeah.
So she's got no outs.
Yeah. You can't get married and you can't become a prostitute. It's pure trap. All right. And Pat, what is your winning answer going to be?
So, I mean, partially, and I'm sure you guys did this, which I have to say, I'm also kind of you did Night of the Hunter. Like, that is my favorite movie. Like, I'm very disappointed I was not here for that one. But I'm sure as part of that, I mean, you come up with you have to come up with a definition of what noir is in order to really answer, is this a proto noir? That in and of itself is a really, really difficult thing to do. There's even debates. I mean, is noir a genre? Is it a style? Is it what is it? My personal take is noir is a style. It's not a genre of film, because a lot of people would say, well, no, noirs are detective films or whatever. They have to have specific content. That to me is the genre, not a style. So if you're going to go and say, okay, noir is a style, and typically then it has to involve, typically it involves very specific types of sort of lighting and imagery and sort of things like that. To my mind, I don't think this fits that. It does have that gritty realism quality, and even the fact that this guy says, like, he actually mentions Pabst, which to me is funny, because like Pabst actually is now the Pabst brewery is the one that actually makes McSorley's beer now. So I think that's actually particularly
Full
yeah, full
circle.
circle. It's actually that place, because it is PBR actually, Pabst makes McSorley's beer now. That's where it's brewed. So it does have that sort of gritty realism to it, but that's realism. That's not noir, to my mind. Like noir is not gritty realism. That's just realism. So to my mind, noir has to have a specific sort of like tonal quality and sort of lighting characteristics and sort of which you'd see in a traditional noir. I don't think this fits that, to my mind. I don't think that's accurate. I think he's wrong. Now there are certainly elements that have, okay, as you were saying, like it does have this sort of foggy feel, and it does have a claustrophobic feel, and it does sort of have some characteristics of it, but I would not qualify this film as noir. I don't think that critic is correct, in my opinion.
Yes, I 100% agree. The reason I picked this quote was I found it bizarre that you would qualify this as noir. What is interesting about kind of melodrama, looking at back at the history of melodrama, was that it's sort of considered the first realism in the melodramatic plays of the 19th century, because you're dealing with sort of lower class people who are not just kind of comic buffoons, right? It's not like the comedy play. It's actually a tragedy about people struggling against actual conditions in the world, even though it's sensationalized. But the idea of then saying it's realism, gritty realism, and noir, all of that's the same thing, and this movie is all of that, I found incredibly strange. We had also done Caligari, the Cabinet of Dr.
Oh, yeah.
Caligari, earlier. Oh yeah, which is kind of very expressionistic, and that to me is much closer to noir than this movie
Yeah, I
was.
mean, to my mind, like noir is like is Nosferatu or M or
Mhm.
something like that. Although M isn't the silent movie, but is something like that. Like that's noir to my mind.
Yeah.
Like or at least, as you said, like proto noir.
Mhm.
But it's just like, this doesn't seem that at all.
Yeah.
For our listening audience, M is actually on our calendar in this
Oh.
year, so that
Mhm.
is something that will be coming up and we will be discussing.
Yeah. But yeah, I did find that strange. But I'm interested in how this style, how the kind of an impressionistic. It seems like we've landed on that as a term for the style of this movie. How that kind of style fits in with maybe realism, and does this movie contribute at all to realism, or is it um, so kind of locked into that style that it doesn't really get at the kind of realism we might recognize.
So Tom, what movie would you say does show noir?
I think Cabinet has elements of it. I think, well, I mean, Pat, but you're interested in kind of doing a noir too, right? So like a Maltese Falcon, right, would be your
Yeah, I mean
stereotype.
that
Mhm.
is yeah. If you're going to pick a noir film, like that's the
Mhm.
one you're going to start with. I mean, that's
Yeah.
usually considered the first one. That's the one you're going to start with if you're gonna have a noir film. Yes.
Yeah, so it's like shadowy. It's a little unrealistic in terms of kind of the maybe the lighting and the sets. Not necessarily bonkers or expressionistic, but it's not exactly like perfect realism, right? It's kind of a shadowy. The tone is a little darker. You typically, it's more urban, which I guess would also, this film would fall into that. But yeah, just think of like your classic fedora wearing detective film.
So then, would you say Broken Blossoms is what you would have expected to see if you were in London in 1919 walking down the street? Is that what you guys mean by gritty realism?
I think it's what this film critic means by that. And I think it's coming out of a tradition where even the representation of kind of the lower class was, in the maybe the earlier part of the 19th century, that was kind of new and therefore considered sort of a reflection of reality. Right? I mean, if you go back to, and here's the giant history lesson. If you go back to like the early part of the 18th century, you start getting this thing called like the bourgeois tragedy, with something like the London Merchant, which I know our former alma mater, Holy Cross, did, I think in 2013 or something like that. But the London
Yeah, a few years
Merchant,
ago.
yeah, that's a 1731 that originally came out. And it was kind of like a sensationalized, super melodramatic play about merchants, hence the title, who gets, and one merchant gets involved with a prostitute who destroys his life and gets him to kill someone, and just wreaks havoc. And the kind of the idea is, this is reality. It's the real world is made of these kind of merchants and these apprentices and these prostitutes, and you better be, if you want to be a good merchant and a good person, kind of walk the line, right? Observe reality. Reality is gritty, and if you want to kind of get through it, you have to kind of observe abstinence and good morals and whatever. And the play actually made a ton of money because it was like the play that apprentices were allowed to see. So once a year, all the apprentices would go to this play and watch it and be like, listen here, don't kill your employer for a prostitute. That's not good. And that kind of became one of the sources of melodrama. But it was considered like realism. Like this was, not about kind of the upper classes running around and frolicking anymore. It was sort of, um, it was how they thought of the kind of the real world. And so what ends up kind of happening, it seems to happen all the time, is like what is considered gritty realism is just sort of um thrown off to the next generation. And I think like one of the best examples of this is like Sarah Bernhardt was considered by like the year 1900 to be kind of a over the top actress. But if you ever read like George Bernard Shaw used to write theater reviews about her, and she was mostly complimented by being intensely real. Like that was her idea. And so it seems like realism is a sort of standard of good. Like it's just, going back to like the mid 18th century, realism just meant good. And then the next generation was like, that isn't good, this is good. And that just seems to be how realism functions in terms of performances.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me this movie, it's like it's realistic in the sense that like probably if you compare it to I think your Shakespeare example probably isn't necessarily off. Like if you go and compare it to like Macbeth or Lear or sort of these like you know majestic tragedies, yeah, it's not that. It's meant to be sort of like as we said, sort of like a simple piece about simple people. In many ways it sort of gets to that, like Arthur Miller would go and claim that he took the tragedy and made it about the common man, and that he's kind of bringing it back down and trying to make it, and he probably wouldn't have said Death of a Salesman is realistic per se, but it is meant to be a sort of more representative of life. Does this film meet that quality? I mean, they even say at the beginning that it's like, you might argue that people like this don't exist, and it's sort of like, yeah, because probably they do, but they don't. Like no one is this sort of one-dimensional, and so it is representative of a reality, but it's not realistic by any stretch.
Yeah, I would say I don't think you get Arthur Miller and that kind of low mimetic tragedy without things like this, right? I think that the kind of the melodrama or sensationalist theater allows you to put kind of low characters on stage or in front of the camera later on, and that eventually gets you to Miller and people who follow him. All right, shall we go into the last question?
Let's do it.
It's time for question 6.
So this is James Agee, film critic, film writer, and this is him on Griffiths. And this is an extended quote, and so I'll give it to you. Griffiths, quote, had no remarkable power of intellect or delicateness of soul, no subtlety, little restraint, little, if any, taste, whether to help his work or harm it. Lord knows no cleverness, no fundamental capacity once he had achieved his first astonishing development for change or growth. His sense of comedy was pathetically crude and numb. He had an exorbitant appetite for violence, for cruelty, for the Siamese twin of cruelty, a kind of obsessive tenderness, which at its worst was all but nauseating. However, Griffith was a great primitive poet, a man capable, as only great and primitive artists can be, of intuitively perceiving and perfecting the tremendous magical images that underlie the memory and imagination of entire peoples. Interpret Agee's quote using Broken Blossoms and examples from that film.
Locked in.
Sure, locked in.
Locked in.
All right. And excuse me. All right. We'll have KJ started off.
I think we've been talking a lot about how this movie loosely represents peoples and caricatures, and we talked about how Battling Burrows doesn't have anything in his house that shows that he's a real person, and he just represents this is what that archetype is supposed to be. So yeah, I guess I agree with the quote, and I interpret it to be factual, and I think he's just commenting on stuff we've commented throughout this episode.
I think his first part is he's probably being a little bit harsh, but he's accurate in the sense that I mean, in some ways, the guy is working with a relatively simple tool set. So, and my understanding is, you know, he's unique in the sense that he's sort of building a film as its own medium, in the sense that he's not just like trying to just take a play and put it on a stage and then just film the play. Like he's trying to do something that is not done, that you can't do with live theater, and he's not just trying to film it and make that live theater. Like he is trying to build something that's unique, and so that does often limit his tool set. So in that sense, he is sort of a primitive poet. You know, he's sort of what you might expect from somebody who doesn't have a lot of forms or options at his disposal to kind of use. So yes, that part is sort of accurate, and I think he does sort of, if you're going to look at this film in particular, like yes, he does sort of have this. There is, I like the Siamese twin of just butchery and just sort of like just schlocky sentimentalism. Like yeah, that is more or less what this film is. But I think it's probably he's being a bit hyperbolic in the interests of getting his point across. So yeah, that part is accurate. Like this film has, it's just it's all over this film. It's just like it's hard to even cite individual examples. It is what this film is. Like everything is about that. It's about the extreme contrasts between the violence and sort of this sort of sentimentalism. But that being said, it's still and I think that is the point in his second part, is it's still effective, because it's effective because this guy is sort of building up a new set of forms and ideas and sort of methods of creating a film like this. So yes, it's accurate. It's certainly a bit extreme, but I think it is accurate given the way the film works and the way the film's meant to work. I don't think it's meant to work differently. It does exactly what it was meant to do with what he had at his disposal.
I think he was stating that this movie was far from subtle and, based on his standards, over the top in its portrayals, but it was an interesting story about the corruption of society and the effect on the innocents. And the reason I bring this up is the two of the three main characters, Chin Wan and Lucy, are introduced as good characters, and throughout this film, one of the good characters, Chen Wan, it seems, has developed some sort of addiction and tries to better, his initial attempts of bettering the Anglo-Saxons have seemed to kind of gone to the wayside, and in the end he ends up murdering someone, and then Lucy, with all her good intentions of trying to be a good, pure person, the White Blossom, ends up being murdered. So that is what I think this person was saying within his quotes.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's just give points to everyone. We're all good friends. Everyone wins.
You get a point, and you get
a point, and you get a point. Yeah.
Or 2 points.
Yeah, 2 points, which I believe, yeah, Pat then wins. I think you got points for every question. So there you go. Yay. But yeah, I do like your point, Pat. The kind of like the limited tool tool chest, or the limited tools in the tool chest is I think a good metaphor. You introduced that a little earlier in the podcast. I did like the term, that quote jumped out at me for this idea of the primitive poet. This sort of writing and kind of crudity, because everything here is kind of on the surface. It's a very rich and textured surface, but there's like no depth to any of this. It's like the entire thing is on an XY axis. There's no Z in this picture. I was kind of interested in what the effect of kind of reducing subtlety or eliminating subtlety from the film actually is. Like, how does that kind of affect us today?
What are your thoughts, Tom?
What happened with a lot of this movie is I sort of turn my brain off a lot. And sort of enjoy the atmosphere. I'm sort of engaged emotionally in terms of watching Lillian Gish's Lucy, that type of thing. It seems to be that the lack of complication allows a lot more attention to go to the performers, especially to Gish, and I think that may be part of why it's so remarked on. Her performance is remarked on so often, is the fact that you are given you're given everything about her up front and with what she's doing. It's kind of a pure vulnerability, and the sort of archetypal way that people perform things does allow for I don't want to say vulnerability, but it does allow you to either have kind of no access to the actor underneath because he's just or she's just being this person, or it sort of frees them to be kind of more emotionally accessible. And so that was kind of my experience, was that it was much more of a sensuous experience than, let's say watching Night of the Hunter, which I think was a very complex and kind of very dense film.
To your point, it's an interesting point. You kind of do need to shut your higher brain functions off a little bit, because it is like it's partially because of just as we've said at the very beginning of the film, like it's problematic in some of the way that it approaches, as we said, just sort of its race issues and things like that. And you kind of have to just accept that that's what it is. Like, it's just like that's just not going to go away, and so you kind of have to just shut it off in many ways. And I think it's true. It's just sort of it's not a film that you're gonna spend a lot of time trying to find hidden meaning in, which is, Night of the Hunter has a lot of that. You can certainly watch that film and find symbols and things like that. Like, this thing doesn't really have that. It just doesn't exist. Everything's is right up front. So it's immersive, and it's not. It's sort of emotionally immersive, but it's not completely immersive. Like, if you just kind of give yourself up to it and watch it and just appreciate the performances and appreciate everything going on, it's effective. But if you try to really dive into what its message in many ways is and what's going on with it, it kind of just falls apart. But it doesn't mean it's not good. It just means that, like, I think it's an interesting point that, like, it's about the performances, it's about what comes out of it. It's not necessarily about its message or its sort of intellectual quality. That's not. This is much more a true piece of just art. It's meant to be looked at and seen how beautiful it is and how pretty it is. It's not meant for you to sit there and try to change the world from it. I mean, I think it was meant to at the time. I just don't think it does that anymore.
Yeah, because his intentions tend to be, especially from, like, in his movies Intolerance, he being D.W. Griffith, his movies Intolerance and later were sort of, message movies. Like, here's our moral, we're going to give it to you up front. But I can't imagine anybody actually went to the movie to digest the moral. But yeah, I think that, once you're given the moral you're supposed to imbibe, once you're given the message, you can sort of ironically suspend the message and get more into the performances.
And in some ways, it's actually taking a step back as well. It's also, like, to your point about, a lot of these characters are meant to be archetypes and this kind of stuff, and especially given that there is sort of this very sort of, I mean, again, it's obviously melodrama. It's not the same thing, but it is kind of, it has a, to borrow one of our favorite terms I've used before, the Brechtian, that these characters they're not meant to be real people per se. They're meant to be classes and groups and things like that. They're meant to represent this kind of thing, and it is, I think, to try to, the point is to try to get you to imbibe this message. But I just think, given the content, it just doesn't work. It's much more, it's emotionally manipulative, not intellectually manipulative.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's emotionally manipulative, not intellectually manipulative. Oh, that's, yeah.
Well, Tom, this was a great group of questions. Pat finishing the episode off with 9 points. I came in at 5, and KJ rounded it out with 3. Patrick, congratulations for taking this one down. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back with Movie Rant in a moment. Welcome to Talking Pictures Trivia, the podcast in which a group of Welcome to Talking Pictures Trivia, the podcast in which a group of
B-side. KJ here from Talking Pictures Trivia, and I'd like to tell you about Talking Pictures Trivia B-side. Can't get enough of Talking Pictures Trivia? Head on over to our website, YouTube channel, or where you normally listen to Talking Pictures Trivia to find the B-side, where we talk about the movies you love. Talking Pictures Trivia B-side goes further into the movies we talk about on this podcast and compares them to other media that has been on our mind. Here's a quick sample.
And we are trying something new on Talking Pictures Trivia. We are trying a game inspired by a possible mistranslation in the last movie we watched called Broken Blossoms. It has to do with counting beans and seeing who can count correctly. For the math nerds out there, it's mostly mod 4. That may make sense to very few of our listeners. Luckily, there are only very few of you.
or co-hosts.
Or co-hosts, either way. So we have 4 players is the way this game works. And we're going to name the players now. I'm KJ.
I'm Tom.
Nick.
I'm Doug.
All right. The gang's all here. You guys may...
Flip this record over by heading to TalkingPicturesTrivia.com, our YouTube channel, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to hear more on the B-side.
And we're back.
It's time for Movie Rant!
I just want to throw out one just because I know it's like, I think Tom mentioned this before, that it is probably the most talked about scene in the movie, is the, like, we touched on it, but we didn't really get as much into it, is the closet scene where she's like trapped in the closet and doing like the spin around thing, and how sort of supposedly emotionally effective it is. What's people's take on that scene? Like, is it still effective now? Like, is it like, what is the deal with that? Like, why is it so talked about? Why is that, if people know a scene from Broken Blossoms, they know that scene, and not many people know much from it anyway, but if they do know anything, they know the closet scene. Like, that's the thing that everyone is the most famous thing in that movie. Like, what's people's take on that? Why?
I have to say, when I first watched this movie, I knew there was a famous closet scene, because I think we talked about it with our professor at that time. And when I first watched the movie, I was waiting for the closet scene, or the part of the closet scene that's most famous is she turns in a 360. So she turns in a circle. She's desperate to get out of the closet as her dad's breaking in, and so she turns in a 360-degree circle, which is what a circle is. And when I first watched the movie, I kind of missed it. I was waiting for it, and I just didn't see it. And watching it again, I sort of had the same response. I didn't miss it this time, because I'd seen the movie before. But I couldn't quite understand why someone would lose their lunch watching that scene live, right? Like, somebody supposedly had actually thrown up because it was so emotional when they were watching Griffith and Gish film that scene. And honestly, like, I love Lillian Gish in this. I do think it's worth kind of raving about her performance. I don't quite get the critical attention that the closet scene gets. I don't know. What do you guys think?
It was an effective scene showing that there was no way out. She was backed into a corner, and she's looking for a way out of this, and she literally goes all the way around to right where she started, which was effective. But I also agree. I don't know why it was such a critically acclaimed element. If anything, the item I brought up earlier, where she used her two fingers to make a smile, actually resonated more with me as a very unique style from this movie, or a presentation of how she acted her role. So that one actually jumped out me more than that specific scene.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was the famous scene that I should have been watching for. The scenes that I kind of liked with her were her and Cheng Huang together. I thought some of those were the more emotional, gripping scenes.
Yeah, I asked the question because I was curious, because it is one of those things where I know it's supposed to be really famous, and I think I've had the same reaction, which is like, I just don't really get it. Like, it's not like, people seem to act like it's like, the end of like Seven and like what's in the box type thing. Like it's meant to be this like shocking thing, and I'm like, I just don't get it. I just don't.
Yeah, I guess it is a visual symbol, I guess, right? Because there is no way out type thing, which is reiterated through the whole movie. Right? There's no way out for these people. Like it's considered, it is considered one of the great moments in the history of film performance. And I really don't understand. And I agree with you, KJ, that the kind of the scenes on the second floor of the store are really kind of sweet and nice. I think the close-ups don't work for me there in that scene when they close up on the two of them. It looks a little lechy, honestly, at that point. But I do think that is kind of the best of Gish is when she's kind of responding to him. And it's also when the movie's kind of most itself, right? It's like these two people are, the most ethereal and the most kind of beautiful that they can be in their essence, to use one of the terms we referenced earlier. But yeah, I don't know, Nick, did you have a visceral? No, you said, Nick, you didn't have the kind of visceral response to the closet. It was
No, I thought it was well done. It just, if I was going to say something that I thought was unique that resonated, it was that other thing where she would force a smile. Like that's the again, I think she does it a few times, but that's what sticks in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. That's kind of what sticks in my mind too, in terms of a particular thing or whatnot.
I wanted to mention one thing I noticed. The intertitle cards sometimes had different backgrounds, and I had never seen that in a silence film before. There was like a Sakura background sometimes, often when Cheng Huang was quote unquote speaking. There was sometimes like words of wisdoms, and they had rays of sunlight behind them. And when it was the boxer, when it was battling Burroughs, it was always that traditional black, and I think it had DG at the bottom for the director, for D.W. Griffith.
Yeah, I thought they all had DG, didn't they?
Oh, even the fancier slides? Yeah, they may have.
Yeah,
Sure.
I think that typically you'd either get the production company or the director's initials at the bottom of intertitles. Yeah, yeah, there's the kind of like the tinting to things, be it the intertitles or the the actual different scenes, was incredibly effective. I think the way that the different backgrounds or the different kind of coloring of the intertitles, I didn't recognize that. I didn't catch that. I didn't pick up on that.
Yeah, the only one I noticed was, you're right, I noticed the sunlight one, that tended to come on, and yeah, I think that was usually the moments of inspiration ones, like but he resists and keeps his love pure, and then they'd have like the sunlight ones coming down. I didn't actually notice any of the other ones, but it is, I did notice that at least on that card, and I think I remember it pops in a couple other times that, yeah, the cards do change. And yeah, I don't like, that's another thing, I just have no idea, having not seen that many silent films, that I don't know if other films do that or not.
Yeah, I don't remember with other Griffith films. I watched a few of them for this show. But it is interesting. Do you see them like evolve or something, KJ?
No, they're sporadic kind of throughout.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just wondering if that's an opportunity to be creative. I'm just surprised that more movies didn't do it, or is there something a comedy could have even done with the title cards, or maybe they have? I'm not too familiar with silent films either, but I just thought it was interesting to see different backgrounds compared to that classic black with the white text and that particular font that we're used to.
Yeah, I mean they do different functions. I know in silent films, intertitles became seen as crutches, that if you weren't a particularly good storyteller, you needed more intertitles rather than fewer. I know Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin had a contest to see who could make a movie with a full-length movie with the fewest intertitles. I think Chaplin won. I think he only had like 14 in a 2-hour movie or something like that. I mean, I don't know if Griffith was particularly concerned
Wasn't there
with
an
that.
Academy Award at one point though for intertitles?
Was there
Wasn't there like
really?
an Academy Award for intertitles at one point? I think there was. For like a very brief time, they had an Academy. I think they did. I'm like
Wow, let's
reasonably
look that
sure
up.
that I think there
So
was a
this movie was
category.
just Oscar bait, is what this was.
The Oscars didn't exist.
1919, they did. I think that was like the first year.
No, 1926, I think.
Oh, was it 26?
Because I think Richard Barthelme helped establish the Motion Picture Association. Yes, there was.
See?
First
Yeah,
Academy
I
Award
thought-
presented 1929. Best Writing title cards. That's amazing. It went to Joseph Farnham.
So they did. So there was some.
There
They did
was a lot of-
recognize at
yeah.
some point later on that there
Mhm.
was some art to them.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool.
It's got to be the easiest category to win these days, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it went for the films. It went for a few films that he made that year: Fair Coed, Laugh, Clown, and Telling the World. The award was never given again.
Yeah, you wonder. They're like, this is the stupidest.
Well, it was 1929. They had like talkies. They were like,
Yeah.
no one wants to make this crap anymore.
It was that one guy telling him, "Hey, wouldn't it be great if we had an award for intertitles?"
Yeah. It's a hereditary title now. Is the guy who's in charge of selecting the intertitle award? It's his son and grandson. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. But in this movie, the intertitles are used in different ways. There's like actual what people are saying. There's also, like the message from the director. Moments of inspiration, or the kind of like a fortune cookie moments pop up. But yeah, there is a decent amount of variety. I will have to say the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari intertitles were a little more interesting.
Yeah, they would have won up against this one for best in a title card.
Yeah. Just another technical thing: the tinting in this movie. I really love that, and I watching silent movies again. We watched another silent movie we watched that was Dr. Caligari, as I mentioned before, which is almost no tinting to it, right? I think it's just sepia colored. And it really has a great effect, and I think it involved employing like an entire staff of young women to individually paint the different film stills.
Cells.
Yeah, yeah, I know it's probably grueling work, but it was I don't know, it had a kind of a great effect that I sort of miss today watching movies. That kind of the red, the really kind of purplish red in the upstairs of his store, kind of made that tone. The kind of bluishness when you looked out to sea at the cityscape. Yeah, really kind of it was very effective. Anyway, I don't know. What do people think of that?
Well, before we get too into that, this movie is actually in the public domain. So I watched this on Amazon Prime. So it had those different tints and the different colors. But if you got another version on Internet Archives or anywhere from the public domain, it may or may not have had that tinting. In other words, that tinting, in most theaters back then, they may or may not have had the tinted version that was played. So I think it's kind of a privilege that we get to see the tinted version.
Is that true?
I was going to say I'm not 100% certain my version was tinted. Yeah,
really?
I was just going to say, yeah, I don't think mine was.
Oh wow!
That's why I was like, I don't think I had that.
That's amazing.
I don't remember it.
Yeah, that's amazing. I did not. That's interesting. That different people had kind of different experiences of this. Oh wow! Yeah, I guess because you could only color so many of them, right?
Yeah, if you're doing it by hand, that's a pretty labor intensive.
Yeah, as opposed to a
Mhm.
click on iMovie or something like that. Oh wow,
Mhm.
that's interesting. Yeah, so I guess a lot of people saw the kind of the B side of this movie. Oh, okay.
It's sort of like it's like going to see the not the HDMI. What do you call the really
Oh,
fancy ones? Where they charge you like $25 for the
oh,
same movie.
IMAX is that?
IMAX, yeah, this is the
Yeah.
IMAX equivalent. Like you had the IMAX film and you had the non. Like, yeah,
Yeah, it's like Avatar. I saw Avatar in 2D, and
You didn't see Broken Blossoms tinted? Oh, terrible.
the closet scene makes so much sense with a tint.
But that's what I'm wondering. Like maybe I missed something. Maybe that's why.
But to answer your question, Tom, I was actually fairly distracted by the tinting
Oh,
because I
really?
was trying to figure out why they were doing it. I didn't know if it was they just. I know some like older
Mhm.
movies they kind of played with the colors too in a much less effective way. They just it felt a little bit like a mistake, like they just picked up the wrong camera film and it had
Mhm.
water damage or something. Um, so I wasn't sure why they were tinting the different scenes.
No, okay. I think it's kind of to set the atmosphere, to set the tone. I mean, again, I think it's going back to, we talked about this a lot, the kind of impressionistic feel of the movie, which I guess is maybe the best term for the style of it, right? Is this sort of, you know, like impressionism. And I think it just kind of gives you the impression or feel of the error, right? Like this room is this kind of purplish red. That's kind of how this room feels. Um, it's the sense of a place reduced to color, right? So like the lakeside is kind of bluish and so forth.
So another film that used this to great effect, although I haven't seen it in a while, was Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy. So to pull everything together, is Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy a noir, and was it heavily influenced by Broken Blossoms, the tinted version?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I think Dick Tracy is in fact considered a remake of Broken Blossoms in some circles.
I'd like to once again congratulate our winner of the week, which is Patrick. Thanks again for joining us today, Patrick.
Thank you for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Awesome. I'd also like to thank our articulate editor, KJ, who masterfully crafts these episodes. I'd also like to acknowledge IMDb, which is a great resource for movie information. Check out our website, talkingpicturestrivia.com, for more information about us and our episodes. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, and Stitcher, as well as our YouTube channel. We are extremely grateful for any positive reviews, as those help others like you find us. If you like what you hear, remember to like and subscribe to our show. Join us next time when we discuss Nick's recommendation from 2004, Shaun of the Dead. Definitely a different subject matter than today's episode. It should be a fun one. See you then. Ding, 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 ding.